The cellar door exploded inward in a shower of splinters, and Jedediah Sawyer came up off his cot with a scalpel already in his fist before his eyes had even opened all the way. "Don't move," he said, voice rough with sleep, though the words died somewhat when he saw what had come through his floor. She was massive. Not the way a bear was massive, or the way a drunk teamster was massive. She filled the low cellar the way a storm filled a valley, green-gray skin, catching the single shaft of moonlight that spilled down through the broken boards above, tusks curving up from her lower jaw like ivory hooks. She wore fitted travel leathers, cinched tight at the waist with a wide belt, the laces at her chest pulled snug enough to show the shape of her beneath the hard leather, and there was a long knife on her hip that she had not drawn. She had, instead, both hands full of his bread. "There is no need for that little knife," she said, and her voice was low and warm despite the tusks, despite the 8 inches of height she had on him, despite the fact that she could have snapped his neck between 2 fingers. "I only wanted the bread." Jedediah stood there in his nightshirt, scalpel trembling slightly in his hand, staring up at an orc woman who had just torn the lock off his cellar door like it was a dry twig, and found that his heart was pounding for reasons that had very little to do with fear. "That's my winter bread," he said, which was, in retrospect, a foolish thing to say to a woman who could have crushed his skull. She looked down at the 2 loaves in her hands, then back at him, and one corner of her mouth curled up around a tusk. "It is very good bread," she said. "You should be flattered." That was how it began. Not with an arrow through the dark, not with wagons burning on the trail, but with a hole kicked in the floor of the cellar beneath Jedediah Sawyer's apothecary shop, in the border town of Kessel's Ford, on a night in early autumn when the wind smelled like the first frost and a starving orc woman decided that his bread was worth the risk of getting caught. Kessel's Ford sat where the wagon road crossed the river, half a day's ride from the treaty line the humans and the orc clans had drawn a generation back after the last war finally burned itself out. It was not a rich town, but it was a busy one, full of freight haulers and trappers and the occasional orc trading party come down from the high country to swap iron and hides and horn for salt and cloth, and the strange sweet human liquors the clans had developed a fondness for. There was an uneasy peace along that river, the kind of peace built on 20 years of men and orcs remembering, very clearly, what the war had cost them both, and neither side wanting to pay that price again. But peace was not the same as trust, and trust was not the same as welcome, and an orc woman climbing into a human man's cellar in the middle of the night was, by any measure, a hanging offense in Kessel's Ford if the wrong person found out. Jedediah knew that. He set the scalpel down on the shelf beside his jars of dried yarrow and willow bark, slow, so as not to startle her, though something told him this woman did not startle easily. "You're hurt," he said. It was not a question. He had spent 11 years patching up men who did not want to admit they were hurt, first as an army surgeon's boy during the border skirmishes, then as the only apothecary for 40 miles in either direction, and he knew the particular way a person held themselves when they were bleeding somewhere they did not want you to see. She stood with her left arm pressed close to her ribs, and though the leather there was dark, in this light everything was dark, and he could not be sure until he came closer. "I am fine," she said too quickly. "You broke a lock with your bare hands and you're standing in my cellar at midnight stealing bread instead of running back to your own camp," Jedediah said, taking one slow step closer, palms open. "A person who is fine does that a little less." For a moment she only stared at him, and he had the strange sensation of being weighed, the way a trader weighs iron against his palm before he commits to a price. Up close she was younger than he'd first guessed, maybe 25 summers, with dark hair bound back in a thick braid threaded through with small bronze rings, and eyes the color of good river amber. There was a healing scar along her jaw, old, pale against the green-gray of her skin, and a fresher graze along her collarbone that told him she had been in a fight recently. Not this fight, an older one. "My name is Gorza," she said finally. "Gorza Gorhorn, and I did not come here for a lecture from a small human man with a bread knife. It's a scalpel, Jedediah said, and my name's Jedediah Sawyer. I run the apothecary upstairs. If you're hurt, I can help. If you're not, you can finish that loaf and go, and I won't say a word to anyone, Orc's honor or whatever you people swear by. Something flickered across her face at that surprise, maybe, or the first crack in whatever wall she'd built coming down that hill tonight. You would let me walk out of here, after I broke your door. I've got a spare board and a new lock in the shed, Jedediah said. The door's replaceable. You're not if you go and bleed out in a ditch somewhere because you were too proud to let a stranger look at your side. She laughed then, short and surprised, a real laugh that showed the white of her teeth around the tusks, and something in Jedediah's chest turned over slow and warm, like a stone rolling in a riverbed. You are either very brave or very stupid, apothecary. Been told both, usually by the same people, he said, and held out his hand not to shake but palm up and offer. Let me see it, please. She looked at his hand for a long moment. Then, with the wary grace of a wild thing deciding to trust a snare might not be a snare after all, Gorza Gorhorn stepped closer, set the 2 loaves of bread down on his workbench, and drew back the edge of her leather jerkin to show him the wound along her ribs. It was a spear wound, shallow but ragged, 3 days old by the look of the yellowing bruise around it, stitched crudely with what looked like horsehair by someone who had been in a hurry. 2 of the stitches had torn loose. Lord, Jedediah breathed, already reaching for his lamp, striking a match with hands that had gone steady the moment there was actual work to do. Sit down before you fall down. Who did this? Men, Gorza said, and there was iron in the word. 3 nights ago, bandits, not soldiers, though they wore stolen colors to make us think otherwise. They came for the war horn. Jedediah paused, lamp halfway to the hook. The war horn. It is not your concern, she said, too fast, and he let it go, because a woman bleeding through her side in his cellar was more urgent than whatever politics had put the wound there. He got her sat on the low stool by his workbench, brought his needle and thread and the good clean bandages, and set to work restitching what some field medic in her camp had botched 3 days before, all the while keeping up a low stream of talk, because he'd learned long ago that patients did better when they weren't thinking about the needle. So you climbed a fence, forded a cellar window and broke a lock, all to steal 2 loaves of bread with a spear wound in your side, he said, threading the needle by lamplight. I did not eat well on the ride down, Gorza said, and your town's market was closed, and I did not wish to be seen buying bread from a stall with Orc iron in daylight. There are men in this town who would rather put an arrow in me than take my coin. There are men in every town like that, Jedediah admitted. Doesn't make it right. Hold still, this next part's going to sting. She did not so much as flinch when the needle went in, though her jaw tightened, and Jedediah found himself watching the line of her throat, the pulse there, faster than he'd expected for someone so composed. He told himself it was only professional interest. He was lying to himself, and some small, honest part of him knew it even then. There, he said at last, tying off the final stitch and laying a clean bandage over the wound. That should hold better than the last one. Whoever did that first stitching should stick to sharpening spears. He is dead now, Gorza said matter-of-factly. The bandits killed him first. He was my cousin. Jedediah's hand stilled on the bandage. I'm sorry. You did not do it. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read, something between suspicion and reluctant gratitude. You are strange, apothecary. Most humans in this valley look at me like I am a wolf that wandered into their sheep pen. Most humans in this valley haven't had a spear through them and then walked 8 miles to steal bread instead of asking for help, Jedediah said. That takes something. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. Both, Gorza said, and there was the ghost of that curl at the corner of her mouth again. She stood, testing her side, rolling her shoulder, and seemed satisfied that the stitches would hold. Then she picked up the 2 loaves of bread from the workbench and with a directness that startled him held one out. Take it back, she said. I have taken enough from you tonight. Keep it, Jedediah said. You need it more than I do. I'll bake more." She studied him again with that same weighing look, and then unexpectedly she reached out and pressed something small and cold into his palm, a coil of thin bronze wire, one of the small rings from the end of her braid, twisted free with 2 fingers. "For the door," she said. "It is good bronze. Sell it or use it to fix your lock. I do not like owing debts." "You don't owe me anything." "I owe you a door," she said simply, "and a debt for the thread in my side. Gorza Gorhorn pays what she owes." And then, before he could argue further, she was moving toward the broken cellar door, favoring her left side only slightly now, pausing at the threshold to look back at him once more. "You are a strange man, Jedediah Sawyer," she said, and there was something almost warm in the way she said his full name, testing the shape of it. "I may come back and steal more of your bread." "I'll leave a loaf on the windowsill," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. She laughed again, that same short, bright sound, and then she was gone into the dark, moving with a huntress's silence despite her size, and Jedediah Sawyer stood alone in his broken cellar holding a coil of bronze wire and feeling, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, entirely awake. He did not sleep again that night. He sat at his workbench turning the bronze ring over in his fingers, thinking about amber eyes and a laugh like a struck bell, and told himself firmly that this was foolishness, that an orc warband's daughter for the rings in her hair marked her as clan-blooded. He knew that much from years of trading with orc parties, had no business occupying a border town apothecary's thoughts. He told himself that several times, in fact, and believed it less each time he said it. He did leave a loaf on the windowsill the next night. It was gone by morning. He left another the night after that. By the 5th night, when he heard the soft scrape of boots against the shed wall outside, he was already standing at the window with 2 loaves and a jar of honey, and when Gorza Gorhorn's face appeared out of the dark, framed by moonlight, wary and pleased all at once, something in his chest settled like a key turning in a long rusted lock. "You did not have to wait up," she said. "Wanted to," Jedediah said. "How's the side?" "Healing because of you." She took the bread and the honey both, and this time she did not vanish immediately into the dark. She lingered at the sill, forearms braced on the wood, looking in at him with open curiosity. "Why do you do this?" "Leave bread for an orc woman who broke into your cellar. Would you believe me if I said I liked the company?" "I would believe you are lonely," she said, not unkindly, and the truth of it struck him harder than he expected from a woman he'd known 5 days. "Maybe I am," Jedediah admitted. "Doesn't make it less true that I like yours." Gorza considered him for a long moment, amber eyes bright in the lamplight, and then she smiled, slow and real. "Then perhaps, apothecary, we should stop meeting through windows like thieves and meet properly instead. Tomorrow. The old ruined watchtower above the ford where the north road bends. I will bring my own bread this time, since you seem determined to give away your whole larder." "I'll be there," Jedediah said, and meant it more than he had meant almost anything in years. The watchtower above the ford had been built during the last war and abandoned since, a crumbling finger of gray stone overlooking the river where it split around a gravel bar. And it was there, the following evening, that Jedediah Sawyer climbed the broken stair with a satchel of cheese and dried apples, and found Gorza Gorhorn already waiting, seated on the tower's collapsed outer wall with her long legs stretched before her, watching the sun bleed orange and red across the water. She had changed nothing about her dress, the same fitted travel leathers, the laces at her chest, the wide belt with its long knife. But in the dying light she looked less like a wound come to steal bread and more like something out of an old story, some warrior queen carved from the hills themselves, and Jedediah found himself standing at the top of the stair a moment longer than necessary just looking at her. "You are staring, apothecary," she said without turning. "Can't help it," he said honestly, and came to sit beside her on the wall, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, though he was careful still not to presume too much. They talked as the sun went down, of small things at first, the town, the trade routes, the particular stubbornness of goats. And then, as the dark came on and the first stars pricked through, of larger things. She told him of her clan, the Gorehorn line, warband leaders for 4 generations, of her mother who led 300 spears and had raised her daughter to lead as many, of the Warhorn the bandits had come for 3 nights before he'd met her, a relic of black horn and silver banding, older than the treaty, said to have been carried by the first chieftain to ever sign peace with the human kingdoms. It was sacred to her people, a symbol that the clans could make war and choose instead to make peace, and its theft was an insult that could unravel 20 years of uneasy calm along the river if it were not recovered and if blame fell wrongly. "Do you know who took it?" Jedediah asked. "Bandits wearing stolen colors," Gorza said, jaw tight, "made to look like soldiers of the border garrison. Someone wants my clan to believe humans took it so that we make war instead of peace." "Someone wants my clan to believe humans took it," she repeated, "and there are men in this valley who would be glad to see that war come." Jedediah thought of the men he'd overheard at the trading post that very morning, muttering about orc raiders and stolen goods, about how a body couldn't trust a tusked savage as far as they could throw one, and felt a cold unease settle in his stomach. "There are fools on both sides of that river who'd be glad for a reason to hate each other properly again," he said. "But not everyone, not me." "No," Gorza said, looking at him with an expression that was almost soft. "Not you." He told her in turn of his own life. A field surgeon's assistant during the last border skirmishes, stitching men who screamed and men who didn't, learning the terrible arithmetic of who could be saved and who could not. And then, when the fighting stopped, settling in Kessel's Ford to open his little apothecary shop, because he'd had enough of watching men die and wanted, instead, to spend his years keeping them alive. He told her he had no family left, a mother dead of fever, a father who'd never come home from the war at all, and that he had built his whole life around being useful to people who mostly forgot his name by the time their wounds had healed. "I will not forget your name," Gorza said, and there was a weight to the words that made his breath catch. "I'm counting on it," he said. It was on the 3rd night they met at the tower, a week into this strange courtship of bread and moonlight and low talk over the river, that she first dared him. "You flinch," she said, watching him lean back from the tower's crumbling edge, where the old stones gave way to a 40-foot drop onto rock below. "Every time you come near this wall, you flinch." 40 feet of empty air will do that to a man," Jedediah said. "A dare, then," Gorza said, and there was mischief in her amber eyes now, a challenge he was coming to recognize and God help him to enjoy. "Walk the wall, all the way to the broken tooth of stone at the end and back. If you do it without falling, I will tell you something true about myself that I have told no human. And if I fall, then I will catch you," she said simply, "because I am strong enough and because I would rather catch you 100 times than let you break on the rocks even once." There was something in the plain, unadorned way she said it that undid him a little. He stood, wiped his palms on his trousers, and stepped up onto the ancient wall, the wind off the river tugging at his coat, the drop yawning below him, and walked. His heart hammered the whole way, not from the height, though the height was real enough, but from the sheer foolish thrill of doing something reckless to impress a woman who had never asked him to be anything but exactly what he was. He made it to the broken tooth of stone at the far end, turned and walked back, and when he stepped down onto solid ground again, Gorza was there, closer than he'd expected, something bright and fierce in her face. "Well," he said, breathless. "You did not fall," she said. "I noticed." "I am almost disappointed," she said, and he laughed and she laughed with him, and then, true to her word, she told him something true. "I have never let a man walk beside me and live to tell of it, not truly beside me as an equal," she said, quieter now, the mischief fading into something more honest. "My mother says a warband leader has no equals, only followers and enemies. I have believed that my whole life. I am no longer certain I believe it." Jedediah did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, only reached out and took her hand where it rested on the stone, and she let him, her calloused fingers curling around his, and they sat like that a long while, watching the river run black and silver under the stars, saying nothing more that night because nothing more needed saying. The dares became a habit between them after that, a game with rules only they understood, each one pushing a little further than the last, not out of recklessness, though there was plenty of that, but because it gave them both a way to close the distance between an orc warband's daughter and a human apothecary, without having to say the frightening, enormous thing that was growing in the space between their hands. He dared her to try his mother's old recipe for honeyed bread, and she declared it an insult to real bread and ate the whole loaf anyway. She dared him to spar with her using wooden practice blades, and put him on his back in the dirt inside 4 seconds, then hauled him up by the collar laughing so hard she had to wipe her eyes. He dared her to let him teach her 3 words of his own tongue's poetry, and she dared him, in turn, to learn a war chant in hers, and he butchered the pronunciation so badly that she had to sit down on the tower steps, tusks bared in helpless laughter, before she could catch her breath enough to correct him. And on a night 2 weeks after the bread and the broken lock, with the wind cold enough now that frost silvered the grass, she dared him to kiss her. They were sitting on the tower wall as had become their custom, shoulders touching, her arm looped loosely through his against the chill, and she turned her head to look at him with those amber eyes gone dark and soft in the lamplight from the lantern between them, and said, "I dare you, apothecary, to kiss me and to mean it." "That's not fair," he said, though his heart was already racing. "You know I've wanted to for days." "Then it should not be difficult," she said, "to do what you already want." He kissed her. It was not gentle, not at first. There was too much held back in both of them for gentleness. But it gentled as it went on, her hand coming up to cup the back of his neck, careful of the strength in her own grip, his fingers finding the laces of her jerkin and stopping there, reverent, not daring further. And when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and Gorza Gorehorn, who had led men into battle and buried a cousin 3 weeks past and broken a lock with her bare hands to steal bread from a stranger's cellar, looked at Jedediah Sawyer like he was the most dangerous thing she had ever dared to want. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what frightens me." They did not have long to sit in that fear before the world outside their small stolen hours came crashing back in. It happened on market day, 10 days after that first kiss, when Kessel's Ford filled with wagons and stalls and traders from both sides of the Riverork iron and hide and horn, laid out beside human cloth and salt and tools, a fragile commerce that had held the peace together longer than any treaty ink. Gorza had come down with a small party from her clan under a truce banner, her mother's cousin leading the trade delegation, and Jedediah had come to the market square with his own stall of remedies, and they had agreed, with the particular ache of people trying to be sensible, that they would not seek each other out in public, not yet, not until they understood what they were to each other and what the world would allow it to be. The plan lasted less than an hour. It was old Marsh Calloway, a leather-faced freight hauler with a grudge against orcs going back to a brother lost in the last war, who started it. He'd had too much of the strong cider sold at the corner stall, and when he saw Gorza standing at a trading table not 30 feet from Jedediah's own, he began to shout first about thieving greenskins, then, more specifically, about a stolen war horn, and how everyone knew the orcs would use any excuse to blame good honest humans for their own missing trinkets, and how it was a fine thing that decent folk had to stand around and watch tusked monsters walk their market square free as you please. A crowd gathers fast in a small border town when there's a fight brewing, and this one gathered faster than most, drawn by the old fear that never quite slept in a place built on the edge of a war both sides remembered too well. Someone shoved Gorza's cousin. Someone else drew a knife, not aimed at anyone yet, just drawn, the way a threat gets drawn before it becomes a wound. And Marsh Calloway, red-faced and cider-brave, grabbed a length of wagon chain from his cart bed and swung it at Gorza's head. She caught it on her forearm. The chain cracked against leather and bone, and she did not even flinch, only wrenched it from his grip with terrifying ease. But by then 3 more men had waded in, and the truce banner meant nothing to a mob with old grief in its blood, and it was Jedediah Sawyer, small and unarmed and entirely unafraid in that moment in a way that surprised even himself, who put himself between Gorza and the nearest raised fist. "Enough!" he shouted, loud enough that it carried over the crowd's ugly murmur. "Enough, damn you all! She hasn't drawn a blade. She hasn't raised a hand except to stop that chain from splitting her skull. What in God's name are you doing?" "Get out of the way, Sawyer," Marsh spat, chain still in his fist. "This ain't your fight." "It's my fight the second you swing that chain within 10 feet of me," Jedediah said, standing his ground though his heart hammered fit to burst. "And it's my fight because I know this woman, and I know she came here under a truce banner to trade in good faith, same as you're supposed to be doing instead of drinking cider and starting a war with your bare hands." "You know her," someone in the crowd sneered, and the word landed with an ugly weight, a dozen assumptions packed into 2 syllables, and Jedediah felt Gorza go very still behind him. "I know her," he said again, steadier this time, "and I'd stand here and say it 100 times before I'd let a mob beat a woman half to death over a rumor none of you can prove." It was Gorza who moved then, stepping up beside him rather than behind him, her hand closing not on her knife but on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity so plain that the crowd's murmur faltered. "The war horn was stolen from my people," she said, voice carrying clear and hard across the square, "by bandits wearing stolen colors, meant to look like your soldiers so that fools like this man," she nodded once, contemptuously, at Marsh Calloway, "would believe humans took it, and my clan would believe the same, and both of us would bleed for a lie while whoever truly stole it laughed from safety. I did not come here to fight you. I came here to trade, and to find the truth, and I will not be beaten in your market square for a crime I did not commit." There was a long, taut silence, the kind that could break either way, and then mercifully the garrison captain, a grizzled old soldier named Holloway who had fought in the last war and had no patience left for starting another shove through the crowd with 2 of his men, and the moment cracked and scattered like startled birds. "Go home," Holloway barked at the crowd, "all of you, before I start remembering names for the stockade." He turned to Marsh Calloway with a look that promised a night in irons, and then to Gorza, more wary but not unkind. Your people, best you finish your trading and ride back before dark. I can't promise you'll get a warmer welcome twice." Gorza held his gaze a moment, then nodded once, curt, and gathered her cousin and the rest of her trading party, and it was only as she turned to go that her eyes found Jedediah's again, and something passed between them that needed no words: gratitude and fear, and the terrible new knowledge of exactly how much danger loving each other might cost them both. That night she came to him not through the cellar window but through his front door, bold and unhidden, and when he opened it to find her standing on his step in the dark, travel leathers dusted with road grit, amber eyes fierce and frightened both at once, he did not hesitate to pull her inside. "You should not have spoken for me," she said, even as her hands found the front of his shirt gripping tight. "It is dangerous for you now. That man will not forget." "Let him remember," Jedediah said. "I meant every word." "They will call you Orclover," she said, testing the ugliness of the phrase like a wound she was pressing to see how much it hurt. "They will call you traitor, worse." "They can call me whatever they like," he said, "so long as you keep coming back." She looked at him then with an expression he had not seen on her before, something cracked wide open, and said, "Lo, no man has ever stood between me and a crowd before, Jedediah Sawyer. Men stand behind me or beside me when I lead them, but never between. I did not know I wanted that until you did it. Get used to it," he said. "I intend to keep doing it." She kissed him then, fierce and searching, and this time neither of them pulled back to think about what it meant. And later, much later, when they lay tangled together in the narrow bed above his apothecary shop, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing idle patterns along the old scar on her jaw, she told him the rest of what weighed on her. "My mother has summoned the clan elders," she said quietly. The war horn must be found within the month, or the elders will declare the humans responsible by default, and there will be war along this river again, Jedediah. Real war. Not raids and rumors, but banners and blood. Then we find it, Jedediah said without hesitation. You didn't think I'd let you go hunting bandits alone, did you? He said. I've stitched enough wounds to know exactly how this ends if you go in without someone watching your back. 2 sets of eyes. Better odds. You are an apothecary, not a soldier. I was a field surgeon's boy for 6 years during the last war, he said. I know how to move quiet, how to read a camp, and how to patch a wound fast enough to keep a person breathing until we're somewhere safer. That's worth something, even if I can't swing a sword like you can. Gorza was quiet a long moment, studying him in the dark, and then she laughed softly, disbelieving and fond all at once. Gorza Gorehorn, daughter of a warband leader, about to go bandit hunting with an apothecary and a bread knife. It's a scalpel, Jedediah said, and she laughed again and pulled him close, and for a little while longer the fear of what was coming stayed at bay. The trail to the bandits' camp was not hard to find, not for a woman who had grown up tracking deer and men both through mountain country. 3 days after the market square, Gorza's cousin brought word from a trapper loyal to the clan that a band of rough men had been seen holed up in the ruins of an old logging camp 2 days' ride north. Flush with coin and iron, they had no honest way of earning, and it did not take much imagining to guess where a stolen war horn might have ended up. They rode out at dawn, just the 2 of them, because Gorza would not risk her mother's warriors on a lead that might be nothing, and because, though neither of them said it aloud, they both wanted badly to be the ones who fixed this together before the elders' month ran out and the fragile peace along the river came apart at the seams. The logging camp sat in a hollow between 2 ridgelines, a scatter of half-collapsed timber shacks around a central longhouse that still had smoke curling from its chimney, and they came upon it in the blue hour before dawn on the 2nd day, having left their horses tethered a mile back and come the rest of the way on foot, low and quiet through the pines. 12 men at least, Gorza murmured, crouched beside him in the tree line counting the shapes moving between the shacks by lantern light. Maybe more inside. That's a lot of odds against 2, Jedediah said. I have fought worse odds. I believe you, he said. I'd still rather not test it if we don't have to. If the horn's in that longhouse, maybe there's a way to take it quiet before anyone even knows we were here. There was not, as it turned out, a way to take it quiet. They made it as far as the longhouse's rear wall, where a gap in the old timber gave a sliver of view into the single-lit room within. And there, hanging above a crude mantel amid a clutter of stolen goods, was the war horn itself, black horn banded in tarnished silver, exactly as Gorza had described it, unmistakable even in poor light. Jedediah felt her go rigid beside him at the sight of it, felt the low growl building in her throat, and put a hand on her arm. We need a plan, he whispered, not a charge. I know, she breathed, though it clearly cost her. The plan, such as it was, fell apart within minutes, because a boy no older than 15, sent out to fetch water, rounded the corner of the longhouse and found them crouched there in the dark. And before Jedediah could so much as raise a hand to signal quiet, the boy's shout of alarm split the night wide open. What followed was chaos, men pouring from the shacks with torches and blades, the bandit leader, a scarred brute named Coyle Dunmore, who Jedediah recognized distantly as a man once run out of Kessel's Ford for cheating at cards, bellowing orders, and Gorza Gorehorn rising from the shadows like something out of the old war songs she'd taught him, blade drawn, tusks bared, placing herself instinctively at Jedediah's back. Stay close, she said, low and fierce. Watch my flanks. I will watch yours. There was no time for fear, only for motion. The first man came at them with a hatchet, and Gorza took him down with a single brutal strike, spinning immediately to catch a second attacker's blade on her own. And Jedediah, scalpel useless against steel, snatched up a fallen torch and swung it hard enough to send a third man stumbling back with his sleeve alight, buying half a second that Gorza used to put her knife through his shoulder instead of his heart, disabling rather than killing where she could. Because even in the chaos of battle, some part of her chose mercy, where mercy could be afforded. Back to back they fought, and it was in that desperate, roaring press of torchlight and steel that Jedediah understood, with a clarity that cut through even his fear, that this was what she had meant about equals. Not that he could match her strength, because he could not by half, but that in that circle of danger they moved as one thing, her strength and his quickness, her ferocity and his steadiness, each covering what the other lacked, and it was the most alive he had ever felt in his life. Coyle Dunmore himself came at Gorza with a stolen orc-forged blade, clearly looted along with the horn, and the fight between them was brutal and fast, and it was going badly. Dunmore was a big man, trained, and he caught Gorza's wounded side with a glancing blow that made her stagger, when Jedediah, without thinking, without any plan beyond raw desperate need, threw himself at Dunmore's legs and brought the man crashing down into the dirt. It cost him. Dunmore's elbow caught him across the temple hard enough to see stars, and for one terrible moment the whole world tilted sideways, but it was enough of an opening for Gorza to recover her footing and drive her blade home, ending the fight, and then she was there, hauling Jedediah up by the collar with hands that trembled now, not from strength but from fear, checking him over with frantic urgency. "You fool," she said, voice cracking. "You reckless, foolish man, you could have died." "So could you," he managed, head still ringing. "Seemed a fair trade." The remaining bandits, seeing their leader dead and their camp overrun by what looked, in the dark and the torchlight, like a full orc raiding party rather than two exhausted lovers who had gotten desperately lucky, scattered into the tree line rather than press the fight further. And in the sudden quiet that followed, Gorza pulled Jedediah against her, careless of the blood on both of them, and held him so tightly he could feel her heart hammering as hard as his own. "Never again," she said into his hair. "Never do that again." "Can't promise that," he said, muffled against her shoulder. "Not where you're concerned." They recovered the war horn from the mantle where it hung, black and silver and undeniably real, and Gorza held it in both hands like something holy, like something that might yet undo the worst of what had almost happened between two peoples who had barely learned to stop hating each other. "This ends it," she said quietly. "The elders will see the truth now. No war. Not because of this, at least." "Not because of this," Jedediah agreed, and looked at the graze along his temple, the blood on both their hands, the ruined camp around them, and thought that whatever came next, whatever it cost them, he would not trade this reckless, terrifying, magnificent woman for a single hour of the quiet, lonely life he'd had before she broke his cellar door. They rode back to Kessel's Ford 2 days later, weary and battered, the war horn wrapped carefully in cloth and lashed to Gorza's saddle, and word of what they had done to riders against a bandit camp, a stolen relic recovered, a war averted outran them along the trail, so that by the time they crossed the ford itself, there was already a crowd gathered on the bank, human and orc both, drawn by rumor and by the sight of the war horn's silver banding catching the afternoon light. Gorza's mother was there. Gorza had not mentioned in all their nights on the tower wall quite how imposing her mother would prove to be, a woman built like a mountain given voice, war-scarred and gray-braided, flanked by a dozen of her clan's finest warriors, her face unreadable as her daughter rode up, and dismounting in one fluid motion, laid the war horn at her mother's feet. "It is recovered," Gorza said, formal and proud, though Jedediah could hear the exhaustion beneath it. "Bandits wearing stolen colors took it to force blame onto the humans and drag both our peoples into war. They have been dealt with." The elder Gorhorn studied the horn a long moment, then lifted it, turning it in scarred hands, and something in her weathered face eased, some tension held for weeks finally allowed to break. "You have done your clan a great service, daughter," she said, and then her eyes moved past Gorza to Jedediah, still mounted, blood-streaked and travel-worn, and her expression hardened again into something far more wary. "And this human, he rode with you." "He fought beside me," Gorza said, and there was no hesitation in it at all. back to back against 12 men, and he put himself between me and a killing blow when my own guard was down. I would not have recovered the horn without him, and I would very likely be dead. A murmur ran through the gathered clan warriors, and through the growing crowd of townsfolk on the human side of the ford as well, and Jedediah felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, judging, weighing, and he made himself sit straight in the saddle and meet them without flinching, because he had learned, in the weeks since a starving orc woman had broken into his cellar, that flinching had never once solved anything. "He is more than that to me, mother," Gorza said, and her voice did not waver, though Jedediah could see, now, the effort it cost her to say it plainly in front of both their peoples. "I have chosen him, as is my right, as your daughter and as a woman grown under the old customs. I will not hide it, and I will not be shamed from it, not by our clan's old grudges and not by their town's small fears." Jedediah's heart nearly stopped in his chest. He had not expected her to say it here, now, in front of everyone, though he understood, watching her, that this was exactly her way. No half measures, no hiding, only the same fierce directness that had made her walk into his cellar in the first place and take what she needed without apology. The elder Gorhorn's face was a battlefield of conflicting things: pride in her daughter's courage warring with old prejudice, gratitude for the Warhorn's return warring with the deep-worn suspicion of a lifetime spent fighting humans in the mountains. And for a long, terrible moment Jedediah thought she might refuse outright, might order her warriors to simply take Gorza and ride, and leave him standing alone on the riverbank with nothing but the memory of amber eyes and stolen bread. Instead, she looked to the human crowd gathered on the far bank, to Captain Halloway standing grim and watchful among them, to old Marsh Calloway skulking at the edge with a face like curdled milk, and said, in a voice that carried clear across the water, "This human stood between my daughter and a mob in your own market square. He rode into a bandit camp at her side and helped recover a relic that would have cost both our peoples a war neither wanted. If your people still wish to call him traitor for loving an orc, then perhaps it is your people, not mine, who have not yet learned the peace this treaty promised." It was not a blessing, not exactly, but it was not a refusal either, and Jedediah understood it for what it was, a challenge thrown down to both sides at once, a demand that they prove, here and now, whether the peace along this river was real or only ever a truce waiting to break. Captain Halloway, to his credit, stepped forward first. "The man saved lives," he said gruffly. "Stopped a war before it started. I don't much care what shape a person's ears are if that's the measure of them." He shot a hard look at Marsh Calloway, who had the sense, at least, to keep his mouth shut this time. Still, there were mutters in the crowd, old resentments too deep to vanish in a single afternoon, and Jedediah knew, looking at the sea of uncertain faces on both banks, that this moment could still tip either way, that a lifetime of hatred did not unmake itself just because two people had been brave together in the dark. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He dismounted, slow and deliberate, and crossed the shallow ford on foot, the cold water soaking his boots, until he stood before Gorza Gorhorn in full view of both their peoples, human and orc alike, watching in a silence so complete he could hear the river running behind him. "I don't care whose blessing we're supposed to wait for," he said, loud enough to carry, though his voice shook slightly with the enormity of the moment. "I don't care what your elders think or what my neighbors think. I've spent my whole life patching up people who forget my name the moment they're healed, and then a woman broke into my cellar looking for bread, and for the first time since my mother died I felt like somebody actually saw me. Not the apothecary, not the surgeon's boy. Me. I love you, Gorza Gorhorn, and I don't intend to spend one more day pretending otherwise for anybody's comfort." Gorza's eyes had gone bright and wet, an expression so unguarded it made his chest ache to see it on a woman who had faced down bandits without blinking, and she closed the distance between them in 2 strides and kissed him, right there, in the shallows of the ford, in front of her mother's warriors and the human townsfolk both. In front of Marsh Calloway's sour face and Captain Halloway's gruff approval, and every old prejudice either side had carried down from the war kissed him fierce and unashamed and utterly certain, her hands cradling his face like something precious, and Jedediah kissed her back with everything he had, uncaring who watched, uncaring what it cost, because he had never in his life been so sure of anything as he was of her. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the crowd on both banks had gone very quiet, and then, astonishingly, it was Gorza's mother who broke the silence, not with a blessing exactly, but with a short, rough laugh, the laugh of a woman who recognized her own stubbornness reflected back at her. "Well," the elder Gorhorn said, "it seems my daughter has chosen. The old customs say a claiming made before both peoples, freely and without shame, cannot be unmade by elders or crowds. I will not be the one to try." She looked to the human side of the ford, to Halloway, to the assembled townsfolk. "Will your people try?" There was a long pause, and then Halloway shook his head slowly. "Not on my watch," he said. "Man saved this whole valley from a war. Seems to me he's earned the right to choose who shares his supper table." Not everyone in that crowd was won over that day. There were faces that stayed hard, backs that turned. A scattering of townsfolk who muttered and walked away, rather than watch an Orclover claimed in the open like a hero, but enough turned, enough softened, enough decided that a stitched wound and a recovered relic and a kiss taken freely in front of God and the river both meant more than old fear, that the tide of the crowd shifted, slow and uncertain but real, toward something that might, given time, grow into acceptance. Gorza turned back to Jedediah, amber eyes still bright, and there was mischief there now alongside the tears, that same familiar spark that had lit her face on the tower wall 100 dares ago. "I believe, apothecary," she said, "that I owe you one final dare." "After all that," Jedediah said, laughing despite himself, despite the ache in his ribs and the exhaustion in his bones, "you still want to play the game." "Always," she said. "I dare you to marry me, properly, before the season turns. My mother's clan will expect a claiming feast, and your town will expect whatever it is your people expect. Bread, probably." Her mouth curved. "I dare you not to run from either." "I've never run from you yet," Jedediah said. "Not going to start now." They were married 3 weeks later, on a mild afternoon at the edge of Kessel's Ford, where Human Road met Orc Trail, in a ceremony that borrowed from both traditions and satisfied neither purist completely, and pleased everyone who mattered, regardless. Captain Halloway standing witness for the town, the elder Gorhorn standing witness for the clan, Gorza in a length of deep red cloth wound, and belted in the fashion of Orc brides, still somehow unmistakably herself beneath the ceremony's trappings. And Jedediah in his one good coat, hands shaking not from fear this time, but from a happiness so large it frightened him a little. There was bread at the feast afterward, of course there was bread, loaves of it, an old joke turned into a tradition on the spot, with Gorza declaring loudly to the assembled crowd of humans and orcs both that she had married the man for his baking before she'd ever admitted to loving him for anything else, and Jedediah laughing so hard he nearly choked on his own cider, and around them slowly, cautiously, two peoples who had spent a generation distrusting each other across a river shared food and fire and rough goodwill, not perfectly, not without lingering wariness in some corners, but honestly, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. That night in the little apothecary shop above the cellar where it had all begun, Gorza Gorhorn pulled her new husband close beneath the same low ceiling where she had once stood dripping moonlight and defiance with 2 stolen loaves in her hands, and said, low and warm against his ear, "I have led warriors, Jedediah Sawyer. I have faced down bandits and broken locks with my bare hands and stood before my own mother and dared her to refuse me. But I have never in my life felt as strong as I did standing beside you in that river, with everyone watching, and no fear left in me at all. That's what I want for you," he said, holding her, marveling still as he would marvel every day for the rest of his life, that this magnificent, fearless woman had chosen him, out of everyone she might have had and had never once looked back since. Every day, no fear left in you at all. Then give me your hand, she said, and I will give you the rest of mine. He did, and she did, and outside the mended cellar door, the first frost of a new season settled soft and silver over Kessel's Ford, over the river that had once divided two peoples and now, however imperfectly, however slowly, was learning to hold them both. In the weeks that followed their wedding, life did not become simple exactly, because nothing worth having ever seemed to come simple in that valley. There were still cold looks from some corners of town, still mutterings among a few of the older clan warriors who thought Gorza had lowered herself by choosing a human husband, still the occasional traveler passing through who stared too long at the sight of an apothecary's shop, with an orc woman's practice blades hung proudly by the door. But it became, slowly and surely, a good life, a real one, built out of small daily choices rather than grand gestures. Gorza took to helping in the shop in ways Jedediah had never expected. Her knowledge of mountain herbs, gathered over a lifetime of clan hunts and long treks through the high country, filled gaps in his own stores that he had spent years wishing he could close. And more than one patient who came in wary of the tusked woman behind the counter left grudgingly impressed by her steady hands and blunt, practical kindness. She never lost the directness that had first startled him in the cellar. She still spoke her mind plainly, still met every challenge with the same fearless tilt of her chin. But he watched, over those first months, as the wariness she'd carried into every human interaction slowly softened into something like belonging, as she began greeting the baker by name, teasing Captain Halloway about his terrible aim with a bow, sitting with old Widow Ferris on the porch some evenings just to hear the older woman's stories. And the dares never stopped, not really, though they changed shape as the seasons turned. Dares to try new recipes, dares to race along the riverbank at dusk, dares that ended, more often than not, in laughter and tangled sheets and the particular warm silence of two people who had chosen each other, again and again, and found no reason yet to regret it. On the anniversary of that first night, the night she'd broken his cellar door for 2 loaves of bread, Gorza Gorhorn stood in that same cellar, now repaired with a stronger lock and a sturdier door, and pressed a fresh loaf into her husband's hands with a grin that still, after a full turning of the seasons, made his heart skip like it was the very first time. "I believe," she said, "I still owe you a debt, apothecary." "You've paid it 100 times over," Jedediah said, pulling her close. "Then let me pay it once more," she said, and kissed him there in the cellar where it had all begun, with the bread going cold on the shelf beside them and the whole rest of their life stretching warm and certain ahead. And Jedediah Sawyer, who had once been a lonely man patching wounds no one thanked him for, understood at last what it meant to be chosen, fiercely and completely, by a woman who feared nothing in this world except, perhaps, the thought of losing him. She never did. Neither of them did. And in Kessel's Ford, where the river still ran between two peoples who were, slowly, learning to call each other neighbor instead of enemy, the apothecary and his orc wife became something of a local legend. The woman who broke into a cellar for bread and left instead, with a husband who would stand between her and the whole world without ever once being asked, and a man who discovered that being truly seen, truly wanted, by someone strong enough to have chosen anyone at all, was worth every risk it had taken to get there.